I am a man who has two sons.
1, 2. I'm the first to do the story.
That was great. That was good. I told the dudes that they could help with the sermon, and so that was the intro, right? Now, when the second child, Mr. Emerson, was coming along, we had some practice. Levi had been in the hospital after he was born for almost 3 weeks, so we knew kind of anything could happen. So we had set up that Kayla's mom was going to come and take care of Levi, like a week ahead of time, and then we'd go at any time to the hospital. Now, a series of events unfolded where Kayla's mom couldn't come. So we called Marcia, my mom, the mother-in-law, to Kayla, and she was willing to come, but we decided we should probably check with some friends around, and everyone was leaving town around the time Emerson was being born. So Marcia was going to fly in. Now that week leading up to it, a fire broke out right where we live in Pasadena, and it actually blocked the 14-lane highway to the hospital. So on Emerson's due date, not the day he was born, on his due date, the fire leaped over this highway and just charred both sides. We didn't actually have a run-through for that encounter. But eventually, Mom got there. We got to the hospital. Everything went smooth. It was the hospital Kayla worked at. It was the floor that she worked on. She owned the place. And I showed up, and I was just there, I guess. I was actually looking for an illustration to introduce the key idea in the text, and I was kind of stumped. The key idea is going to be presence, how to be present, how God is present, that sort of thing. And I realized that I wasn't a very present person. Often I'll be in moments like, when your first child is handed to you, or when your second child is handed to you, or, a beautiful sunset, or whatever it is. I'll often be thinking about how not present I am and how I should be present in that moment, because I'm just challenged in that way. So I asked Kayla, hey, what's a good example of being present? And she's like that time, you showed up at the hospital, we had to work this huge plan together, so you could come and sit there and do nothing. Just be present with me while I gave birth to our second child. Presence, yeah, that was a present moment. That's right. So presence, we're gonna drill into this idea as we look at Exodus 34, but we'll look at Exodus 32 a little bit again, and then we'll look at Exodus 33, because there's something happening. There's a movement in the text that I want to explore. There is a restoration or a renewal of the covenant that the Israelites have just broke in chapter 32. And I want to show us how that renewal or reviving of the covenant works. But God's sort of in the business of reviving covenants. If you start back in that other book before Exodus, in Genesis, second, third chapter, you get this human, this Adam, and then this human needs a partner. So God, it seems, a good translation is that God takes half of the Adam, or halves the Adam, so that there's sort of two equal parts, and then you have man and woman in the text, Ish and Isha. So humanity is sort of halved, but God puts the Adam asleep first, which is, the proper thing to do. Now, is that a covenant that's going on there? Because something is cut in half? Because when you fast forward in Genesis to chapter 15, God says to Abraham that God's making a covenant with him, and so Abraham shows up and he cuts a bunch of animals in half, as is the custom in a covenant. You walk through, the halved animals, and both parties kind of swear allegiance to each other. So in Abraham's case, again, God puts Abraham asleep. There's all these halved animals, and while Abraham is asleep, God passes through, essentially making a unilateral covenant. Abraham can't keep his end of the bargain. God's going to keep both ends of the bargain, if that makes sense. So there's this subtle covenant with the first humans, then this family. In between there's a covenant with Noah and all living things. Not just like humanity, but everything. And then what happens is, as the story goes along, these covenants are sort of revived. They are reinstituted. They sort of pass along to each family member. The blessing is held alive in Abraham's family. But covenants like the Noah covenant, right, shows up even later in the book of Isaiah, after the people have gone through exile, and God says, I'm going to do another covenant like that, only I'm just going to revive that old one. So covenants are meant to be revived. In the Torah, these first 5 books of the Bible where we're studying, you get to the end of Deuteronomy in chapter 29, and it seems again like there's another covenant. The Torah's not even over, right? Jeremiah picks up that covenant in chapter 31. He calls it a new covenant. Now, it's not really new, okay? Because the word new in Hebrew isn't like, an iPhone, like when I'm filming this on. It's not like a, out of the package type thing. No. The word Chodesh literally just means moon. It's a thing that comes around again. It gets refreshed. New really isn't the key idea. Renewing is the key idea. And this, Jeremiah and Deuteronomy say, this will be a covenant that God will place on your heart. God will actually write God's commands on your heart. Interesting. So all through the Bible, there's this renewal of covenant. So we get to our text, chapter 32, where a covenant is broken. Literally, the people sort of disobey the first 4 commands of the covenant law that they're about to get, these 10 words, these 10 commands. And then, what are we going to do? And God says to Moses, hey, Moses, those people that you took out of Egypt, this is verse 1 of chapter 33. And then by the end, Moses is saying back to God in chapter 33, verse 13, no, remember, they're your people. They're kind of going back and forth. But eventually in chapter 33, some see this as like the center of the story of the Torah. The first 5, 6, if you include Joshua, first 6 books of the Bible, the center of it all. God promises to be present in the land with them. It's like the whole thing. So if you notice this center kind of crowning chapter 33, when you get to chapter 34 and the chapters that follow that, some interesting things start to show up. First of all, the word for presence or dwelling is this word, I think it's over my shoulder here. We have it on this work of art, shakan or shekinah, sometimes people say it. Or when it's applied to this dwelling that the Lord takes up, the tabernacle, that's a Greek word. The Hebrew word is mishkan. You can hear shakan again. And all through the chapters, chapter 25, all the way to the end of Exodus, chapter 40, this word comes up again and again. Presence, dwelling, presence, dwelling, presence, dwelling. God will dwell with God's people, chapter 33. And then Moses is kind of prove it. We're going to go on, but are you really going to come with us? Pass by me. Now, if you're interested in some later study, this word pass by, it's sort of a technical term in the Bible for theophany, or when God shows up, or in this case, in chapter 34, a theophany, because God, Theo, shows up and you see God's backside. It's a Bible joke. Whenever you hear this term pass by, God is showing up. God is going to be present, okay? It's a key term all through the Bible. You get it in 1 Kings chapter 19, when Elijah shows up on Mount Sinai and God passes him by and is found in the sound of sheer silence. Job 9, when Job sees God walking on the water and God passes him by. Or Mark chapter 6, where Jesus intends to pass by his disciples and he's walking on water. Again, God's about to pass by Moses, and God says, you can't behold all of me, and so I will put you in this cleft and I will cover you with my hand and I will pass by. And a better translation of you will see my back is you will see where I just was. You will see the trail of my presence, and you will know I'm with you. I'm with you. I will be present. So God sets up this pass by situation, and God says, Yahweh, Yahweh, right? And then uses two F words, essentially. They'd be translated as faithfulness and forgiveness. It's not just Yahweh, Yahweh. It's the God who forgives. It's the God who's faithful, right? And the words of these powerful sort of all-inclusive terms in the Hebrew language, chesed, steadfast loving kindness. In English, we can't even capture it. So faithful is an okay F word. And forgiveness is uttered a couple times, and it's related to all the trespasses or the sins or all the things you could possibly do. Those are forgiven. This is the sign of God's presence with God's people. Faithfulness, forgiveness. So yes, Moses, God says, I will be present with you the way I was present back in the garden. I will be now present with you in the land. I will be faithful and I will be a forgiver. Thank God. Let's move on. And the story continues, but what you have sort of on either side of this sort of breaking promise to go and then the going is this tabernacle or this mishkan, this dwelling that will be God's mobile presence with the people. And so God literally goes with them. The presence that God has displayed on the mountain is transferred to the tent, and they pack up and they go. Now, when I was, just getting going, right? In my early 20s, I was into racing. And my dad tells this story about, I was doing a triathlon. It was my hometown triathlon. And my dad tells a story about, he was going to show up at the race line. He wasn't going to get up early in the morning and watch me take off, right, on the swim and all that. But he'd be there at the finish, so I'd have to watch for him. So I did my warm-up, got in the water, swam, did the bike, running. And I remember seeing near the finish line, just looking for my dad. And he says that he could see me about a half a mile or quarter mile out. And you could tell it was me because I have this hitch on my shoulders. I'm kind of lopsided. And when I'm really focused, it kind of gets higher and higher. I kind of run like this. And so my dad sees me out in the distance. And Dad, kind of gets in front of the finish line, starts waving his hands like this. Now, my dad is not a very tall person. I'm about a half a foot taller than him, and I'm still under 6 foot. So this small Syrian man is waving his arms as fast as he can, and I see him, and I start picking up. My shoulder gets higher, I'm going, and I remember thinking, I gotta finish, but I need to acknowledge my dad's making a fool of himself. So I remember, hugging and doing one of these, and, that my dad was present. Oh, man, it made that race memorable, because it's not like I won anything, but the fact that my dad was there to watch me finish, right? To bring it in, Rinker! Remember him saying? Man, that's the best race I ever had. I didn't win a thing. Presence. The promise of presence. I'm sure we experience it in parents, right? Being there for us. Maybe, unconsciously they're held for the first time or at a race, the promise of presence. There's something integral to being there, of trusting, in this case, that God is there. It repairs things. It makes things right. A lot could have gone wrong, but presence resets. Resets the relationship. Sometimes resets a whole covenant. So as the story moves on, as the people move into the land and they end up in exile, God follows them to exile. God shows up to this guy Ezekiel who is sitting by the river at Babylon, wondering what happens. He's a priest, wondering what happens when the temple gets destroyed. Because there was the tent, and eventually there was a temple that they made for Yahweh, and then it got destroyed. And so he's sitting there, wondering what it means for God to be present, and God shows up hovering over the water like God did in Genesis, but in this case, it's in exile in Babylon. And this God, who, everyone thought Marduk, the god of Babylon, had killed in Jerusalem, this God resurrects. This God shows up in exile and meets Ezekiel. Ezekiel starts to think, if this God can resurrect, maybe the people might resurrect one day too. So you get all this talk of resurrection in Ezekiel 37. But God shows up again. God shows up in full presence in Jesus. John chapter 1, verse 14, John uses that word, not Shekinah, but the tabernacle word, that Greek word for the tent that God lived in. Jesus shows up and tabernacles among us. Jesus is with his disciples having a covenant meal, it seems. In this case, they're celebrating Passover too, and he is betrayed by one of those closest to him. He's gathered 12, representing these 12 tribes of Israel. He's restarting the whole thing. But he's betrayed in the midst of covenant making. He's betrayed right there. And so he moves towards the cross, right, to restore humanity, to restore Israel, to restore the covenant. There's always some kind of renewal happening in the midst with God. Presence. And when Jesus is up from the grave, there's this promise coming, this spirit that God is going to bring. And so several days go by, 49 days go by, and the disciples in Acts 2 are gathered for a festival. We'd call it Pentecost. They'd probably call it Shavuot or weeks. And it essentially marks the Sinai covenant, the giving of the law at Sinai. And so all the disciples are gathered there celebrating the law. And what shows up? The Spirit. And it shows up kind of like at Sinai, right? There's fire, there's rumbling. If there's some fire, maybe there's smoke. And instead of 3,000 getting massacred like at Sinai, 3,000 at the end of chapter 2 of Acts are brought into the community. Right? There's this restoration happening in this early church with this ragtag people that are chasing after God's presence, that are infused with God's presence, God's faithfulness, God's forgiveness. And so, friends, as winter, it seems, gets renewed today, as snow falls, as the winter holds on for spring, as Lent continues, maybe we'll be reminded that God is present with us. God, through God's Spirit, is with us, right? Snagging our attention, reminding us that we are loved, we are kids of the Most High God. May you look towards your neighbors this week May you connect with those close to you and remind them that God loves them, that this presence that you're experiencing can be experienced even through you in acts of kindness. Much love, grace, and peace to you.